Okay, welcome everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. As I said yesterday morning, I abolished introductions, but I'm just going to let myself say, please give a warm welcome to Tracy Lee Bear. You will not be sorry for coming to this panel.
You may or may not be sorry, no promises. So today, it's Friday the 13th. My daughter was born on Friday the 13th, so she takes this opportunity to celebrate every single Friday the 13th as a birthday. It's always been good luck to us, so today, along with Friday the 13th celebrations, I'd also like to celebrate something else, which is passion. And to get started with the idea of passion comes a story. This is a story of 4-year-old Wabigan, who's a Anishinaabe, beautiful little child living in Canada, and dragonfly dancer. So it was December 6th, and I had just gotten these traditional facial tattoos in a beautiful ceremony surrounded by grandmothers and aunties and sisters. And like any average Cree person, what do you do when you go through a life-altering ceremony? You go to Tim Hortons and you go for a coffee and Timbits. As two of my sisters, myself and Wabigan, sat in that Tim Hortons that cold December day in Northern Ontario, Wabigan turns to me and says, "Tracy, what's your real name?" Now, Wabigan is born and raised in the bush, and she knows her Anishinaabe language. She's grown up in ceremonies, and so this wasn't a different question from this 4-year-old. So I told her it was Kokana Pieces Onamihito, which means Cree for dragonfly dancer. And then she asked me another question I had not considered. What does your dance look like? And so my two sisters looked over at me and they're like, yeah, what does your dance look like? Well, in the middle of that Tim Hortons, I got up in a chair. It was one of those swivel ones. So I was careful, and I did my dragonfly dance. It was a flapping, twirling mess, but it was a dance nonetheless. And Wabigan seemed to like it. And although she was just 4, Wabigan really seemed to get at the heart of a person sitting next to her. What would you say if a 4-year-old asked you similar questions? What would you say if I asked you? Wabigan wanted to know me, and she wanted to know my dance. So let me tell you a little bit about one of my dances, the Indigenous Erotic. In the realm of Indigenous Erotics, reimagining encompasses acts of nonconformity, resistance, and subversion. These are alternative ways of envisioning the past, present, and future. Indigenous writers and artists are generating new landscapes and new possibilities of, quote, Indigenous subjectivity, sociology, and spatiality, a process of creating newness from existing materials seemingly out of nowhere, end quote, from Mark Rifkin. And while Rifkin states that these new possibilities come from seemingly nowhere, there is in fact a rich Indigenous archive from which to draw from. And these landscapes are the collective Indigenous identity stemming from individual and collective experiences of Indigenous people. Reimaginings do not conform to the current logics of settler colonial power. They resist the colonial managing of Indians by the Indian Act and avoid impositions of legal definitions of ourselves. Reimaginings are also subversive actions taken up by Indigenous authors and artists to disrupt colonial stereotypes. This talk presents Indigenous erotics as a state of reimagining the corporeal coalescence of our sexualities, our genders, histories, memories, emotions, and functions as a powerful decolonizing mechanism. But really, what does that mean? Well, it comes down to 2 simple questions. Who are you, and what is your dance? So today I want to tell you a little bit about who I am and what this dance in particular looks like. So it got cut off in this, but this is Kent Monkman in his alter ego as Miss Chief Eagle Testicle. And this is called Dance of the Burdash, and I think it was a video performance installation in 2007. So before we begin to discuss passion, excellence, and the Indigenous erotic, there's a couple of things you need to understand and something I have to confess. It is my intention to disrupt and unsettle you. The topic that led me to Indigenous erotic is disturbing. The heinous and inhumane violence that continues against Indigenous women, girls, and genderful folk is deeply troubling. So why should you be comfortable? Through ceremonies like Sundance, Sweat Lodge, and fasting, I've learned that being physically or emotionally uncomfortable is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, any fleeting emotional or physical pain you have gives you an opportunity to feel gratitude. Too often I am guilty of this too. We fail to recognize the privileged and safe spaces that we occupy, from the health of our bodies to the safety and comfort of our homes. And I know that the 4th day of the fast is the last day of my hunger until I choose the next time to fast. The last round of the sweat may be unbearably hot, but after the doors of the lodge open, my body is free. That is, until I choose the next time to enter a sweat lodge. And my freedoms and privileges I don't take lightly. For many do not have the same reprieve from emotional, spiritual, or physical pain. Our discomfort gives us the opportunity to recognize and reflect our privileged spaces. And it is within this realm of uncomfortability that we can critically assess ourselves and be self-reflective about the space that we live in the world. If you've read my work or even heard me present before, you might realize that I often work in a slightly unconventional way. And as I convey my growing knowledge of the erotic to you, I attempt to ground my work in a critical, Indigenous, anti-oppressive space. As well, there is a physical space to an Indigenous erotic analysis, but we'll get to that in a bit. Daneke, why? Why do this research? From an early age, my curiosity emanated from the erotic parts of stories that were left out, censored, or altered. So when I was little, my mom had these, you can still hear me, right? Yes, okay, I'm hooked up. My mom had these magazines. They were like love magazines, you know, with a glossy cover. It was like True Confessions and stuff like that. And they'd be all over the house. And being a voracious reader, I would pick them up. So I'd start reading them. And then I'd look and I'd try to find the juicy parts, right? And she noticed I was reading these because I was probably 9 or 10. And then she started putting an X on the stories I couldn't read. Well, that was pretty convenient because then I didn't have to look through them all, right? I could go to the ones that I really liked right away. So that sort of was a curiosity when I was younger that spurred me on to look at stories about the erotic, about flesh, about pleasure. Like most good research, my inquiries stem from simple but fierce, long-standing curiosities. And another event happened and changed the course of my research interest. I was invited to participate in a language conference at the Faculty of Maori, Pacific, and Indigenous Studies at the University of Otago in Dunedin, New Zealand, or Aotearoa. After the conference, we settled on the weekend on the marae, which is a traditional sacred Maori gathering place. And we engaged in an intriguing cultural exchange. And little did I know, by the very simple act of sharing stories between Maori and Nehiau or Cree cultures would determine the whole direction of my research. Brought up with trickster tales told by my grandmother and her siblings, I shared some Wissakijakk stories during the night of impromptu storytelling. Wissakijakk is our Cree trickster. And I learned that Wissakijack's Maori trickster counterpart, Maui, share a parallel universe. The teachings from their trials, travels, and misadventures serve as maps to negotiate our Indigenous selves in the world. The repertoire of our trickster stories matched evenly, and they ranged on themes about warning about dangers of gluttony and selfishness to the celebration of love, kinship, and family. We even had similar creation stories. And as the night deepened, the Maui stories became more sexually suggestive, and it was here that my own storytelling faltered, as I had never been told one single erotic Wasaki Jack story. It was at this point that my research into the erotic began in earnest. I needed to learn about the conspicuous absence of the erotic in our traditional stories. Other tricksters like the raven of the Pacific Northwest coast, the coyote of the Southwest US, Nanabush of the Algonquin-speaking people, and rabbit of the Southeastern US, and Maui of Aotearoa certainly had their erotic stories. Stories about their enormous appetites for food and sex. As for crazy sexual escapades, Wasaki Jack stories for my family were almost non-existent. I only found traces of the erotic in the older brother stories, but they seemed like echoes of the rich, complex stories that I heard about Wasaki Jack. So older brother was just as selfish and mischievous as the rest of them, so where were his stories? Were these stories left out on purpose, or did my family just not know any? I wondered about the absence of the erotic in these stories. What forces were at play on my family, on my community? If our stories teach us how to live well in all aspects of our lives, what happens when erotic stories are erased? Is there a connection between the suppression of the erotic in our stories, colonialism, and the endemic sexual violence against Indigenous women, girls, and genderful folk? Who defines my sexuality as an Indigenous woman? I asked myself, if this is my body, then where are my stories? My story, my history, our history includes this. Over the past 60 years in Canada, there has been over 2,000 Indigenous women, girls, and genderful folk who have gone missing or have been murdered. And although we only make up 4.3% of the population, Amnesty International reports that we represent 16% of all murders against women. Indigenous women are almost 3 times more likely to be killed by a stranger than other women. And Indigenous women between the ages of 25 and 44, my daughters are 25 and 27. They are 5 times more likely than other Canadian women to die a violent death. We die at the hands of our partners, husbands, lovers, friends, as much as strangers. Sexual violence is rampant in many Indigenous communities in Canada. Our women, girls, and genderful people continue to be subjected to genocidal violence due to the institutionalization of heteropatriarchal beliefs about gender and sexualities. Heteronormative patriarchy has been so ingrained in our minds, in our communities, that we don't recognize that our recollections and understandings of tradition have changed to reflect the truths of the dominant society. We have internalized the sexual values of concepts of gender and sexuality of the dominant culture. Beth Brandt, Kinte Mohawk for the Tyendega Mohawk Reserve, argues, quote, "Much of the hatred, the self-hatred we carry around inside of us is centuries old. This self-hatred is so coiled within itself, we cannot often distinguish the racism from the homophobia from the sexism. We carry the stories of our grandmothers and our ancestors, and some of these stories are ugly and terrorizing. And some are beautiful testaments to endurance and dignity. And we have to learn to emulate this kind of testimony. Speaking ourselves out loud for our people, for ourselves. To deny our sexuality is to deny our part in creation." Quoted in Coley Driscoll. For the most part, the common occurrence of sexual and gendered violence against Indigenous women, girls, and genderful folk goes unnoticed by society at large, and this blind eye attitude is a brutal reminder of the continuous processes of colonial subjugation at work. We remain mired in a shameful, tragic drama in which every Canadian plays a part. So what is your part? And what is my part, for that matter? My research shares how Indigenous erotica holds a potential for decolonization and corporeal sovereignty and stands as a site of theoretical understanding. For some, the erotic was first shown to us within the pages of the Kama Sutra of Vatsyayana. While many of you might remember Kama Sutra for its detailed drawings and sexual positions, the Kama Sutra actually reveals a critical interpretation of the erotic. Written over 1,800 years ago, this ancient Indian text gives advice on the erotic practice, advice on behavior leading up to, during, and after erotic practices that did not always include sexual intercourse. It is a text of erotic enlightenment, demonstrating that the mind and body are inscribed with erotic areas that respond to physical and mental sensations. The Kama Sutra adds to the understanding of the erotic experience of human completeness. The erotic is not limited to the realm of sex, but is an ethos that reaches into all elements of our lives. In the same way that Driscoll, Rifkin, and Christos demonstrate, philosopher Georges Bataille also encourages people to push boundaries and argues that, quote, eroticism always entails a breaking down of established patterns of the regulated social order, end quote. For me, I just needed to make sense of what the Indigenous erotic entailed and how it differed from just the erotic. And so I began creating a language of theory. I created a method of selecting, arranging, and prioritizing. For me, this language of theory helped me interpret, strategize, organize, and determine my actions. As such, this approach began with 5 elements I found that recurred within narratives and visuals of Indigenous erotic. And the first one was gender. And gender in the idea that decentering Western European tropes of femininity and masculinity, and understanding that gender is on a spectrum. Reimaginings. This would be nonconformity, resistance, subversion, and alternative ways of envisioning the past, present, and future. The ongoing collective was a third grouping, and this was the language and culture through generational narratives, stories, communal language, and memory. Corporeal sovereignty was agency, authority over oneself, choice, embodied sensations of everyday life. And lastly, but not leastly, of course, kinship, relationship ties to family and people and connection to the land and place. It was these 5 branches that were used to explore expressions of erotica by Indigenous and writers and artists to examine the potential of Indigenous erotic that could hold to reimagine our genders and sexualities as Indigenous peoples. Daniel Heath Justice and Quolie Driscoll are instrumental in this area of reimagining. Driscoll relates his reimagining, quote, instead of seeing decolonization as something that is a fixed, definite goal, decolonial activism asks us to radically reimagine our futures, end quote. And Daniel Heath Justice's concept of imagine otherwise has added to my understanding as nonconformity, resistance as decolonial strategies. Similar to Craig Womack's entreaty for Indigenous scholars to dialogue together, I'd like my work to be a part of a larger conversation about Indigenous erotics and function as, quote, beginning rather than ending, more gauged towards encouraging tribal people to talk about literature than dictating the term of such dialogue, end quote. It's not my intention to be definitive on what constitutes an Indigenous erotic methodology or theory, or even decisively state what is Indigenous erotica. Rather, I just want to add my theory and practice of erotic analysis to the continuing dialogue on Indigenous erotica, along with Mark Rifkin, Quolie Driscoll, Deborah Miranda, Kateri Akawenzi-Dam, Daniel Heath Justice, Lisa Tatanetti, among others. So my caveat would then read, these research methods and erotic analysis are used as an exploration of both transgression and transcendence to continue the vital discourse on finding solutions to address the oppression of and to end the genocide against Indigenous women, girls, and genderful people. Audre Lorde self-identifying as Black, lesbian, radical feminist, also has invaluable to my research. In her article, Uses of the Erotic, Erotica's Power in Sister Outsider Essays and Speeches, explores the possibilities of the erotic as a way that women can strive for excellence. Lord's work in the erotic connects well with Justice Miranda, Tatanetti, and Driscoll's examination of the erotic as a method of a wholeness of being, meaning when all aspects of our lives are felt deeply and recognized as a cohesive whole. And this is a quote, "Our erotic knowledge empowers us. It becomes a lens through which we scrutinize all aspects of our existence, forcing us to evaluate those aspects honestly in terms of their relative meaning within our lives. And this is a grave responsibility projected from within each of us, not to settle for the convenient, the shoddy, the conventionally expected, nor the merely safe." Lord's words resonate in my work with missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls when she states that as women we have been trained to suppress the erotic knowledge within us, and in doing so deny ourselves of that power, which leaves us vulnerable to oppression, subjugation, and victimization. Utilizing Lord's understanding of the erotic directly relates with my work in the promotion of corporeal sovereignty and the power that we hold as Indigenous women. Similar to Bell Hook's seminal book, Teaching to Transgress, Education as a Practice of Freedom, I also demand that we think critically about the current realities of the politics of race and gender discrimination. With relation to the topic of Indigenous erotics, I agree with Bell Hook's requirement of a critical dialogue. We have to open up discussions amongst ourselves to talk about our politicized bodies and realize that as Indigenous women, we have specific histories that contain colonial practices. These histories shape our current realities. So to understand our bodies, to promote our bodily sovereignty, we have to address the past. Knowing the oppressions Indigenous women face, we are primed to reimagine our sexuality and open up to our sexual selves. We can then establish new spaces for the creation and dissemination of Indigenous erotica and the celebration of the erotic. The erotic demands the consciousness of being fully alive and whole. In the celebration of the erotic, we can break down oppressive barriers within ourselves and within our communities that subjugate our vibrant sexualities and genders. Lord often explains the erotic as, quote, assertion of the life force of women, end quote, and for, quote, women-identified women, end quote. And I believe this to be true, but the Indigenous erotic expands this understanding as the erotic power being available to all genders. Unrestricted by the gender binary of male-female, the Indigenous erotic is a powerful state of embodied pleasure and sensuality that originates from a synthesis of Indigenous memories, practices, and emotions, and most importantly, recognizes that we are situated and informed by all my relations. All my relations is a term in the belief of the sensory and bodily connection to everything around you. It is the unity and responsibility you have to every living thing. It is the belief that everything is alive, that we're all related and equal. Our respect extends from pebbles to dragonflies, birch trees to rivers, from the teen asking for change on the street to your sister. No one is above the other. Moral guiding narratives reflect the concept that we are all related and that our actions and our inactions have consequences. So if erotic knowledge empowers us, as Lord argues, then we must begin to think deeply about what those knowledges may be as Indigenous peoples and how they are comprised. As Indigenous peoples with complex histories, what are the knowledges that we carry about ourselves? If we are then to, as Lord suggests, quote, scrutinize all aspects of our existence, then we must explore the beliefs that we hold about ourselves, including, but not limited to, our bodies, our land, our spirituality, our sovereignty, and the connection to the principle of all my relations. Indigenous erotic analysis is grounded in, respects, and validates Indigenous worldviews. Embodied experiences work to connect concepts using intuition, as much as intellect. One of the prominent features of this method is a careful unfolding of interrelated concepts that are meant to build into and onto each other. Erotic analysis is an interwoven network of association and a method that creates a greater independence in the learning process. Engaging in the erotic enters a world that encourages the inclusion of holistic knowledges, embodies the sensation of our everyday lives, and the embracement of all capacities within ourselves. An erotic analysis does not require fluency in one's native language. Indigenous scholars can still strive to create a space that centralizes their language concepts, and as Adam Gaudry points out, can, quote, mobilize a range of Indigenous-rooted concepts that can represent key characteristics of our worldviews to an English language audience, end quote. In Sean Wilson's Research's Ceremony, Terry Tafoya warns that practices within the Western paradigm can amputate your sexuality, your gender, your language, and your spirituality. By looking at the individual components rather than looking at the total person and the complexity of the connections and relationships that allow that individual to function, end quote. Tante Otsekia. So I warned you that I don't really adhere to conventional approaches of research, writing, and dissemination. That is a disembodied, objective, conventional academic approach. For me, such an approach of research is often severed from the Indigenous erotic. Divorced from embodied knowledges, the objective voice effectively erases the erotics of lived experiences and rejects the importance of one's identity and location as it pertains to the intellectual domain. Conventional methods usually favor an assumed privileged discourse and dismiss the integration of our full selves. In her article, Bodies of Knowledge, Definitions, Delineations, and Implications of Embodied Writing in the Academy, Alison Knobloch explains that to engage in a disembodied voice in academic writing is to resort to the societal default of the white, male, and privileged. She goes on to say that, quote, those practicing embodied rhetoric can disrupt the mastery in order to reflect the writer's positionality within the academy, end quote. As such, as an Indigenous woman at the epicenter of the universalist discourse within the academy, I cannot afford to ignore my body or attempt to detach my mind and body. To do so erases difference and results in indifference. As much as academic convention would have us believe our views do not stem from nowhere, furthermore, as Knobloch states, a view from nowhere assumes that each body is equally constructed, equally accepted, and equally provided for in the society, end quote. Believing that all bodies are equal and that all voices are heard is dangerous, as it sublimates the fact that there are historically subjugated and silenced voices. Therefore, Indigenous women's bodies, my Indigenous woman's body, and the embodied knowledge we carry harbors the codes needed to survive and thrive. I told you about the 5 recurring elements I found present in the Indigenous Erotica: gender, reimaginings, ongoing collective, corporal sovereignty, and kinship. And this embodied action will help you understand one of these elements. So this is the handing out of the cards. So you're going to get a little card, and on one side of your card, you write an answer to the question, Tante Otsekia. Keep the card. You're going to need the other side. But Tracy, what do you mean, Tante Otsekia? It's Cree. Don't you guys speak Cree? Tante Otsekia is where you from. Tante is where, Otse is from, and Kia is you. Where are you from? Simple question. And keep your card. We're going to use it in a bit. And I'll tell you the story of Tante Otsekia. Tante Otsekia, the old man speaks Cree to me. Edmonton, I reply happily, thinking I know what these words mean. Moya, he says. He shakes his head and says this with a frown. Pointing to my belly, he asks again, Dante Otsekia. In the split second before I speak, I go through my repertoire of answers. Should I explain I've never lived on my reserve in Montreal Lake? No, I don't want to tell him that. Too much information. Do I tell him my white stepfather was a mining superintendent and we lived all over Canada? No, again, too much information. I could tell him I grew up going to schools where I was the only brown face around. No way, that explanation's out. The last thing I want is a pity party. So I decide to explain where my reserve is located. I'm from Montreal Lake First Nation, which is about an hour north of Prince Albert. Again, I hear the word Moya. No, he says to me, and he walks away. I'm left feeling a deep sadness, which I came to understand later as a sense of loss of language and rejection of my people. The exchange left me perplexed for years, until just a short while ago when an elder imparted this knowledge. When another Nehiao, Cree person, asks you the question, Tante Otsekia, they aren't asking you where you were born, nor are they inquiring where you grew up or where you're living now. I said, what are they asking then? Perhaps it's best to explore these Cree words. Tante Otsekia a little closer. Tante is the Nehiao word for where, Kia means you, and Otse means from. On a basic language level, as I learned from my Cree class, it could simply mean where are you from. However, put it together with a little cultural fluency, the sentence has deeper meaning and translate to, who are you from? Tante Otsekia, Otse, in a cultural context, means belly button. Belly button is literally the connection between me and my mother, the connection to my ancestors, to my grandmother, to all of those great-greats. These invisible umbilical cords connect me to my children and their children to come, as much as the past sea of generations. These are all my relations. The old man never asked me for my geographical movements or the where. He wanted to know the who I was connected to, who were my relatives. He wanted me to share who I came from, the who of my family. Wah, Tanse, Tracy Lee Bear, Nitsiga Song, Egwa Kokana Pieces Onamehito, Nigawi Carol Bear, Kukam, Egwa Muswa, Lillian, and Edgar Bear. My name is Tracy Bear, and the name that my ancestors know me by is Dragonfly Dancer. My mother is Carol Bear, my grandmother and my grandfather, Lillian and Edgar Bear. Now turn your card over and answer the question again. Tante Otsekia. How are they different? Are they different? Did anyone want to share? Do they feel different when you write them? Is the first one where you're from embodied? Does it feel you? Could. You could be on the land of your ancestors. But the second one, who are you from? How does that feel? Sometimes they're not easy questions to answer either. Did anyone want to share? We can start with the easy one. Where are you from on the first side?
Well, since I have the mic, I could start.
Okay.
I can never answer this question because my mom is from Lima, Peru, and my dad is from Brooklyn. But he doesn't really identify as being from Brooklyn because he's 1.5 generation immigrant American as well. And so I never know, my sister and brother and I never know how to answer that question. I grew up in suburban Virginia. So I don't feel like I'm from Oakton, Virginia, and I don't feel like I'm not from those other places. And so my card has 8 answers on it. The last of which were my grandmother's, which felt like the truest answer. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. Does anyone else want to share? In the back there.
Thank you for this exercise. On the first side, I just wrote, I was born in Manhattan and lived on Avenue D. But on the second side, I really appreciate the imagery of like following the belly button. I wrote, my mother, Cynthia Hawkins, is from Queens, and my grandmother, Elise Coker, is from Kentucky. I wonder about her in this place often, and once dreamt that I traveled with her back there. And so, yeah, I appreciate how you helped me think about how the daytime life and the nighttime life sort of come together in thinking about the question rephrased that way. Thank you.
Anyone else want to share? We'll do a couple more.
Thank you so much for this exercise. When you first asked it, I kind of couldn't speak. I was waiting for time to pass. The first answers, it was so simple because it feels like a practical question. Like, oh, I grew up in the state of Illinois, and it just made me think of states within the U.S. The second question made me think of much longer histories, much longer generations. And what I wrote was, my mother is guest people. The ethnic group she's from is Kejaran, which is a Chinese minority group, which isn't actually disempowered, but no one knew where they came from. So I'm from a people whose geographic location is a bit unknown. And that's where a lot of emotion, I feel, is. I felt a lot more emotion answering the second question.
Thank you. I put Long Island on the first one, which is kind of hard for me to put sometimes because I feel like it's I've always seen it as like this sort of negation of the identity I thought I wanted to claim for a lot of my life. It just felt like a lot of folks where I was from didn't think of a space for Blackness within Long Island, at least in my experiences. On the other side, though, I was thinking, originally I put my mom, but at hearing the beautiful answers, I was thinking a lot about the shifting geographies of my grandmother's mind. Her, especially with dementia, some of the islands of the Caribbean drift in that weren't there. And so the way that we trace her origins back through my grandmother, it's always adding and sometimes losing islands. And it's just been a very lovely way to think about it, I think, the sort of dynamic rethinking of her own origins and the way that moved through her passage of feelings now in this later phase of her life. Thank you for that, giving us a space to reflect on this.
Thank you. We can always come back if you feel like sharing and not so shy. Ooh. Pardon? Oh, yes, go ahead.
Thank you for this exercise. And I want to share, just because I think saying things out loud changes things, even though I wrote it down and it's in my mind. But on the first side, I wrote that I came from the Bay, because I come from the Bay, but there are lots of bays. And on the second side, I wrote, I come from Helen Stapler, who came from Hedda Post, who came from artist Phillips Stapler, who left Goodwater, Alabama, so that she would never be a farmer's wife. And I come from Jimmy Tinsley, who came from Fanny Gashi, who came from Eva Davis, who left her mother, Mary Davis, in Point Coupé, Louisiana, to pass as white. And I'm a Black woman.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. In the story, and as with you've done today, located ourselves and Specifically, I've located and centered myself within a Nehiawak conversation on language and identity. This story, it demonstrates two key elements: subjectivity and kinship. This first-person narrative emphasizes the subjectivity of the interaction and acknowledges my presence within this presentation. It's critically important for Indigenous researchers to locate themselves in this way. As Verna St. Denis reminds us in her article, Feminism is for Everybody. She encourages Indigenous scholars to recognize the source of our knowledge and reflect on how we situate ourselves within a Western paradigm. She stresses the importance of locating ourselves with an Indigenous voice and utilizes the words of Fanon, quote, "At the very moment when the Native intellectual is anxiously trying to create a cultural work, he fails to realize he is utilizing techniques and language which are borrowed from the stranger in his country," end quote. St. Denis, a veteran educator in anti-racism, likewise underpins the critical importance of Indigenous writers to locate themselves. My inclusion of the story, Tante Otsekia, deliberately inserts my voice and experience into a narrative resisting the danger that Fanon warns against. My Nehiaw Esqueo, or Cree woman resistance, then, embodies the erotic by utilizing Nehiawewin Cree language and techniques of embodied voice within the text and locating myself within a kinship network. So let's put this erotic knowledge to use. Well, what do you guys think? Is there any way I can turn down the lights? Can you guys see that clearly enough? Oh, look at that magic. Disco ball, please. All right, so what do you see here? It's a very simple object. You can just yell out things that you see, or what you think you see. Pardon? Mm-hmm. A hairy box. Yeah. Stones. Yeah. Hot pink. Mm-hmm. What's it doing? It's open. Just a little bit, though. It's like it's being coy.
It's like it's glowing inside, too.
Mm-hmm. This title is called Hot Box, and it's by a Heiltsuk, Northwest Coast artist named Sean Hunt, who's doing some amazing work. And this was part of a Indigenous Erotica show that was in Vancouver at the, what gallery? It was downtown Vancouver, Bill Reed Gallery, and it was called Res Erect. Fabulous name. So this hot box is made of redwood cedar, beaver fur, pink satin, and acrylic paint. It was first exhibited in 2013 at Resurrect, as I said, and it was one of the many pieces of art exploring the sensual and erotic nature of indigeneity. Apart from the obvious sexual connotations that the words hot and box embody, hot box also challenges the expectations of traditional Indigenous art forms and Indigenous sexuality. The sensually clever use of luxurious materials like beaver fur demonstrates a playful attitude towards sex. Beaver fur signifies past and present Indigenous endeavors of trapping and hunting. The fur trade was a huge thing in Canada and parts of the States. It also takes advantage of the colloquialisms of English language, the slang use of the word beaver meaning vagina. The lid opens slightly, coyly reveals a secret pink interior, perhaps a reminder of a time of unashamed, guilt-free attitudes towards sexuality. At first glance, Hunt's hot box covered in fur does not seem to resemble the highly collectible bentwood, redwood, cedar boxes of the Northwest Coast people. These are often painted with recognizable ovoid shapes and graceful forms of the Northwest Coast. But Sean Hunt's cedar box, it's covered. It's covered from top to bottom in luxurious beaver fur. Inside, the box is layered with pink satin material and fleshy pink paint. Hunt plays on the commercial popularity of bentwood cedar boxes, but denies the viewer the expected Northwest Coast designs that are usually carved and painted on the outside. Instead, Hot Box is an unmistakably indigenous and beautiful portrayal of a vagina. To understand this erotic piece, we begin with the process of making a bentwood box. Step 1 starts with a single cedar plank that is slowly steamed and patiently bent into the shape of a box, the technique giving the form its name. Hunt's hot box suggests that the same loving care and patience that goes into readying the vessel, that is, the bentwood box, corresponds to the passion and attention required in foreplay. Hunt suggests that the sensual body parts, like vaginas, need to be handled with proper care and respect initially before one moves on to the next step, whatever that may be. Like Northwest Coast people and their boxes, Hunt continues to prepare his hot box for use. He lines it with silky material and paints the inside top of the box. Now, bentwood cedar boxes have many uses. They may be used for burials, cooking, food storage, transportation, and storing valuables like masks, jewelry, regalia, and sacred objects. With the inside complete, the hot box is ready. But what is it ready for? Will it be a vessel for anything or admired from afar? What would you use a hot box for? Curator Morgan Wood describes Indigenous erotic art as a vehicle for deadpan moral satire, too comic to be pornographic, titillating, juicy, like abandoned crutches in the Church of Love. Indigenous erotica in Hunt's art, like the abandoned crutches in the Church of Love, is used as a tool for the reclamation of his Hiltsuk erotic self. And I suggest that his abandonment of crutches, then, is leaving behind restrictive beliefs about sex, sexuality, and gender. He is healed in the Church of Love through his acceptance of the erotic into his life. He is too comic to be pornographic and deviates from the expected cultural normative, like covering a bentwood cedar box with beaver fur. Hunt disrupts repressive sexual boundaries, becoming a vehicle for deadpan moral satire with a representation of a cheeky and unabashedly proud vagina. The bold beauty of Indigenous erotica, then, allows us the freedom to express and celebrate our sensuality, sexuality, and genders as Indigenous peoples. Indigenous erotica are artistic expressions stemming from a spectrum of cultural and tribal beliefs about sexuality, sexual identity, sensuality, and gender. But this also includes sexual, emotional, physical, and spiritual experiences, the histories and knowledges held by Indigenous people. Drew Hayden Taylor, who is Ojibwe and Caucasian, and he calls himself an Occasion, once wrote that when he was talking about his upcoming book on Native sexuality, people told him that Indigenous erotica was a type of oxymoron. They also joked that the book on Native sexuality would be a very short book. This joke indicates that Indigenous erotica was once quite limited in quantity and accessibility. But now I see it as a fast-growing genre that spans across many mediums, including written and spoken word and visual arts. Since 1999, there has been at least 2 art exhibits of Indigenous erotica, The first one I talked about was Resurrect, and the second was Exposed, the Aesthetics of Aboriginal Erotic Art. So I attended Resurrect and was stimulated and delighted. And like many early spring days in Vancouver, the February afternoon in 2013 that I visited the Bill Red Gallery, the rain fell in heavy, wet sheets. But no amount of stormy weather could have kept me away from that, that's for sure. I felt fortunate this exhibition of Indigenous Erotica proved to be so powerful that it was held over for an extra week. And this holdover meant that my work coincided with the exhibit. There were many standouts for me, but I enjoyed a most sensual piece in a short but powerful video called Put the Lights On by Hannah Leona, who is Cree, Irish, and Ukrainian, and Alida Kinney Star, mixed blood Mohawk, self-identifying. While there were other brighter, shinier pieces, like Sean Hunt's Hot Box or Kawaya Jones' Sexy Rhythms, I was mesmerized by this screen that had a continuous loop of two Indigenous people, a man and a woman. The video footage of Put the Lights On was an extreme close-up of Indigenous woman braiding an Indigenous man's hair. In the second half of the footage, the roles were reversed, and he braided her hair. I won't go into any detailed tribal traditions or understandings about the meanings of braided hair and such, because I don't have that right. But I will say, however, that for many Indigenous people, hair and the braiding of it holds great spiritual significance. At first, I only noticed the raw sensuality and the physical intimacy of this simple practice. The longer I watched this video, the more I began to think about Indigenous bodies and the ways in which we affirm our bonds and recognize the shared Indigenousness of each other. I believe the simple act of Indigenous people braiding each other's hair today, and I mean this between any combination of genders, is an embodied political action, meaning the embodied practice of braiding each other's hair not only reaffirms our current relationship ties by physically connecting and touching, but more importantly, it is the continuance and rebirth of cultural practices, despite colonial policies, that demonstrates the strength and resilience rooted in our bodies. So, we have a lot of visuals, but I want to share with you a little poem. Would you be into that? Yeah. Grizzly Bear Man. You make me wanna lock lips, swing hips, feed you blackberries from between my breasts, eat ice cream, 2 tongues, 1 cone, call you on the phone, make you come long distance, blues tunes, in your ear right here, on the pillow we share, dance in the moonlight like fire, flickering our joy. Oh boy, 10 pounds lost into sweat by acts of lust, passion, and fun. Then let the sun blanket us like newborns,